Before I tell you about the secret weapon that the Apaches brought to World War II, I need you to understand something that might shock you. These men carried a legacy of warfare so sophisticated, so ruthlessly effective, that it had terrified two nations for centuries. When they stepped onto the battlefields of the Pacific Theater, they brought with them skills forged not in boot camps or military academies, but in the unforgiving mountains and deserts where survival itself was an act of war. They had learned to endure what would break ordinary men. They had been trained since childhood in ways that would make modern special forces selection look gentle. And when the United States military discovered what these warriors could do, they turned them into something the enemy had never encountered before. This is the story of the Apache code talkers and the ancient warrior culture that made them unlike any other soldiers in World War II. But here's what you need to know right from the start. The Apaches didn't just contribute to the war effort, they brought an edge that came from generations of tactical brilliance, physical conditioning that bordered on superhuman, and a mindset shaped by the most demanding warrior training system the American continent had ever produced. Before we get into their secret mission during World War II, you need to understand exactly what made an Apache warrior different from every other soldier on that battlefield. And believe me, once you understand where they came from, you'll see why the Japanese never stood a chance against them. Stay with me, because this story goes deeper than you ever imagined. The Apache warrior tradition was not something learned in a few months of basic training. It was a way of life that began the moment a child could walk, and it was as brutal as anything you could imagine. Long before there was a World War II, long before there were code talkers, the Apache tribes had developed one of the most sophisticated and feared warrior cultures in human history, and I'm not talking about Hollywood versions or romanticized stories. I'm talking about a training regimen so intense that it would make modern special forces selection look like a weekend camping trip. Apache boys began their preparation for war from their earliest years. Every single day started with a trial that most grown men today couldn't handle. No matter the weather, no matter the season, these boys were required to wake before dawn and plunge into the nearest river or stream. In winter, they would have to break through ice to reach the freezing water beneath. The point wasn't just to build physical toughness, though that was certainly part of it. The point was to forge a mental state where discomfort simply didn't exist, where the body's protests were meaningless, where the warrior could function regardless of conditions. But the morning plunge was just the beginning. Apache boys learned to run with their mouths full of water, forcing themselves to breathe only through their noses as they sprinted up steep mountain slopes. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty. This was tactical training. A warrior who could control their breathing, who could move silently even when exerting maximum effort, who could run for hours without gasping or panting, was a warrior who could approach enemy camps undetected. They learned to cover 70 miles in a single day, moving through terrain that would stop most people after the first mile. Apache women thought nothing of running 60 miles to visit their children at distant boarding schools, maintaining a steady trot for the entire journey. The physical trials went far beyond running. Young Apaches underwent endurance tests that sound impossible. They would run continuously for 2 full days, without food, without sleep. Their bodies pushed past every normal limit until they entered a state where pain and exhaustion became meaningless background noise. They learned to lie absolutely motionless for hours, becoming so still that they could disappear into their surroundings even in plain sight. There are documented cases of Apache warriors who could make themselves invisible to trained soldiers standing just feet away, using nothing but patience and perfect stillness. They learned to dive into frozen rivers and remain submerged, controlling their breathing and their body's panic response until they could stay underwater far longer than should have been possible. Wrestling games and mock battles weren't recreation. They were constant testing, constant refinement of skills that would mean the difference between life and death. Every game an Apache child played was designed to develop tactical thinking, physical coordination, and the killer instinct that a warrior needed. They crafted their own weapons under adult supervision, learning not just how to use them, but how to make them from whatever materials the land provided. A bow wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of the warrior's will, crafted specifically for their strength and style. An Apache warrior could shoot with devastating accuracy, their arrows capable of piercing armor or bringing down large game at distances that amazed European observers. But here's what really set Apache warrior training apart. It wasn't just about physical prowess. It was about creating a complete tactical mind. Apache boys learned to track prey and enemies across bare rock, reading signs that were invisible to anyone else. They learned to navigate by stars and landmarks, to understand weather patterns and animal behavior in ways that gave them supernatural-seeming knowledge. They learned to survive on practically nothing, living off the land in environments that would kill untrained people within days. They could go without food or water for periods that defied belief, their bodies trained to operate at peak efficiency even when completely depleted. When a young man felt ready to become a warrior, he didn't just pass a test. He entered a sacred process that would span 4 raids. The first raid was the most crucial. The young man was given special equipment, a drinking tube, a scratcher, and a special war cap. These weren't just symbolic items. They enforced discipline that was absolute. The drinking tube meant water couldn't touch his lips directly. The scratcher meant he couldn't scratch his own skin with his fingers. He could only eat cold food. He had to use a special ceremonial language during the raid, replacing everyday words with ritual terms. He was subservient to the experienced warriors, fetching water and firewood, learning through service and observation. This wasn't hazing, this was transformation. The young man was being taught that personal comfort meant nothing, that discipline and ritual created focus, that a warrior must control every aspect of themselves, from their speech to their physical sensations, in order to achieve the mental state necessary for survival in combat. If he performed well, if he maintained perfect discipline and followed every requirement exactly, he would be invited on a second raid, then a third, then a fourth. Only after completing all 4 raids with perfect conduct would he be recognized as an Apache warrior. And what kind of warriors did this system produce? The testimonies from soldiers who fought against the Apaches tell the story better than anything else. They called them the tigers of the human race. They described warriors who seemed to materialize out of empty desert, who could run down cavalry horses over long distances, who could survive and fight in conditions that incapacitated trained soldiers. Mexican and American military forces spent decades trying to defeat Apache bands that numbered in the dozens, deploying thousands of troops against what were essentially small guerrilla units. And time after time, those small units evaded, ambushed, and outmaneuvered armies that vastly outnumbered them. The Apaches pioneered tactics that modern special forces still study today. They understood that direct confrontation against superior numbers and firepower was suicide. Instead, they mastered the ambush, the raid, the hit-and-run attack. They knew their terrain intimately, using mountains and deserts as weapons against enemies who didn't understand the land. They would attack at dawn or dusk when visibility favored them, strike with devastating speed and precision, then vanish into country where tracking them was nearly impossible. They used deception and misdirection, leaving false trails or splitting up to confuse pursuers. They could move through country that seemed impassable, appearing where no one expected them to be. One of the most feared aspects of Apache warfare was their raids. These weren't random attacks. They were surgical strikes planned with precision, executed with brutal efficiency. A raiding party might number just a few men, rarely more than a few dozen, but they could cause damage far beyond their size. They would strike settlements, forts, ranches, or supply trains, taking what they needed and destroying what they couldn't carry. They moved so fast that by the time defenders organized a response, the raiders were already miles away. They could read the land in ways that let them predict where enemies would search and avoid those areas completely. The Apaches also understood psychological warfare in ways that were ahead of their time. They cultivated a reputation for being unstoppable, for being everywhere and nowhere. This reputation became a weapon itself, causing fear that was often more effective than actual attacks. Settlers and soldiers in Apache territory lived in constant tension, never knowing when or where an attack might come. This psychological pressure was deliberate and strategic. Now think about what all of this means. Think about a culture that spent generations refining the art of guerrilla warfare, of survival in impossible conditions, of mental and physical toughness that exceeded anything most militaries could produce. Think about young men who had been forged in this crucible, who carried this knowledge in their very bones. And then think about what happened when World War II came along. When the United States entered World War II, the military faced a critical problem in the Pacific theater. Japan had proven exceptionally skilled at intercepting and decoding Allied communications. American forces needed a way to transmit sensitive tactical information that would be absolutely secure, that the Japanese cryptographers couldn't break no matter how much time and resources they devoted to the task. The solution came from a source that most military planners hadn't considered: Native American languages. The most famous code talkers were the Navajo, and rightfully so. Their contributions to the Pacific campaign were extraordinary. But the Navajo weren't the only Native Americans who served as code talkers, and they weren't the first. The idea had been tested in World War I with Choctaw soldiers, and it worked brilliantly. Native languages, with their unique phonetic structures and grammatical rules that bore no resemblance to any language the Axis powers knew, proved to be unbreakable codes. The Apache tribes contributed code talkers too, though their story is less well known. Men like Paul Burdett, a Tonto Apache, and Nelson Danford, a White Mountain Apache, served with distinction in the Pacific. They were given code names. Burdett was Rebel, Danford was Tartar, and they used their Apache language to transmit tactical information that the Japanese could never hope to decrypt. Working in pairs, one would operate the portable radio equipment while the other sent and received messages, translating between English and Apache in real time during combat operations. The irony of this situation runs incredibly deep, and every Apache code talker was aware of it. For generations, the United States government had pursued policies designed to eliminate Native American languages and cultures. Native children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were punished for speaking their tribal languages. Teachers would beat children for using their native tongues, insisting they speak only English. The explicit goal was cultural genocide, the complete erasure of Native American identity and its replacement with European American culture. Many of the Apache code talkers had attended these boarding schools. They had experienced firsthand the trauma of being punished for speaking the very language that would later become a crucial weapon in America's war effort. They had watched their cultures suppressed, their traditions mocked, their languages treated as primitive artifacts that needed to be abandoned. And then the same government that had tried to destroy these languages suddenly needed them desperately. The languages that officials had once called worthless became priceless military assets. The tongues that teachers had forbidden became the means of securing American victories. The Apache code talkers didn't talk much about this irony. They served with honor and distinction because they understood that the war was bigger than past grievances. They fought not necessarily for the government that had oppressed them, but for their communities, for their families, for their own sense of duty and honor. The warrior tradition they carried wasn't about serving authority, it was about protecting their people. And in World War II, their people included the broader American nation, whether that nation had always treated them fairly or not. But here's where the Apache warrior background becomes crucial to understanding their effectiveness in World War II. These men weren't just code talkers, they were combat soldiers who brought skills and mindsets that other troops simply didn't have. Remember everything I told you about Apache warrior training? All of that training, all of those generations of tactical knowledge came to the Pacific Theater with them. Think about what an Apache code talker represented on the battlefield. He was a man trained from childhood to operate under conditions of extreme stress and discomfort. A man who could function on minimal food and sleep, who could maintain focus and clarity when exhausted beyond what normal training could prepare someone for. He was a man trained to read terrain and move through it invisibly, to understand tactical situations instinctively, to think several steps ahead of the enemy. He carried knowledge of guerrilla warfare that went back centuries, tactics that had proven effective against technologically superior forces time and time again. The job of a code talker in the Pacific was extraordinarily dangerous. Japanese forces specifically targeted radio operators, knowing that disrupting communications could cripple American operations. Code talkers had to operate in the middle of combat, often in exposed positions, transmitting and receiving messages while bullets and artillery fire filled the air around them. They had to remain calm, maintain accuracy, speak clearly despite the chaos, and keep operating even when wounded or under direct attack. The psychological pressure was immense. A single error in translation could send troops into an ambush or cause friendly fire incidents. The responsibility for hundreds or thousands of lives rested on their ability to perform perfectly under the worst possible conditions. This is where that Apache training proved its worth. Where other soldiers might freeze or panic under such pressure, Apache warriors had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of situation. The mental discipline they had developed through years of physical trials, the ability to compartmentalize fear and pain and maintain focus on the mission, the tactical awareness that let them process information and make decisions even in chaos. All of this made them exceptionally effective code talkers. But they brought more than just mental toughness. They brought a warrior ethos that affected everyone around them. Apache culture had always emphasized that a warrior's primary duty was to his fellow warriors, to the band he fought alongside. This created a sense of unity and mutual responsibility that modern militaries try to instill but often struggle to achieve. Apache code talkers weren't just doing a job, they were fulfilling a sacred duty, one that connected them to generations of warriors who had fought to protect their people. This gave them a sense of purpose and determination that went beyond fear of punishment or desire for glory. Consider the specific challenges of the Pacific Theater. It was brutal jungle warfare in conditions that broke down equipment and men alike. The heat was oppressive, the humidity constant, the insects relentless. Disease was a bigger killer than enemy action in many areas. Soldiers had to function in environments where simply staying alive required constant effort. This is where Apache survival skills became invaluable. Men who had been trained to survive in deserts and mountains, who knew how to find water and food in seemingly barren landscapes, who understood how to move through difficult terrain without injury, had significant advantages in jungle combat. The Japanese were formidable opponents who understood jungle warfare far better than most American troops. They used tactics that seemed mysterious and terrifying to soldiers who were used to European-style warfare. But to Apache warriors, these tactics weren't mysterious at all. Ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, using terrain for concealment and advantage, psychological warfare through unexpected strikes. These were the exact tactics the Apaches had perfected over centuries. The Apache code talkers could read the tactical situation in ways that helped American forces adapt and respond. They could anticipate enemy movements, identify likely ambush sites, suggest counterattacks that used the same guerrilla principles the Japanese were employing. The work of code talkers was classified top secret during the war and remained classified for decades afterward. The men who served couldn't talk about what they had done, couldn't share their experiences even with their families. They returned home as just another group of veterans, their crucial contributions unknown. Many Apache code talkers never received recognition during their lifetimes. It wasn't until 2008 that the Code Talkers Recognition Act finally acknowledged their service, and by then, most of them had passed away. Think about what this means. These men carried the weight of two different kinds of secrecy. They carried the warrior knowledge of their Apache heritage, traditions and skills passed down through generations, knowledge that had helped their people survive against overwhelming odds. And they carried military secrets, the classified operations and communications that had helped win the war. They couldn't talk about either one in ways that would give outsiders the full picture of their contributions. The physical toll of combat in the Pacific was severe. The campaigns stretched for years, moving from island to island, each one a brutal fight through terrain that favored defenders. Code talkers were constantly in danger, constantly under pressure, constantly pushing themselves beyond normal human limits. And because they were Apache warriors, trained from childhood to ignore their body's signals, to stop, to rest, to seek safety, many of them pushed themselves too far. They developed injuries and illnesses that they ignored or minimized, continuing to serve even when they should have been evacuated for medical treatment. The casualty rate among code talkers was significant. Of the approximately 400 code talkers from various tribes who served in World War II, 13 were killed in action. Many more were wounded, some multiple times. They earned medals and commendations, though again, the specific nature of their service remained classified, so their citations were often vague, talking about bravery and dedication without being able to explain exactly what they had done to earn such recognition. After the war ended, the Apache code talkers returned to reservations that were still dealing with the legacy of government oppression. They came back to communities where opportunities were limited, where the promises made to Native American veterans were often broken or ignored. Many struggled to readjust to civilian life. The warrior culture that had sustained them in combat didn't have an outlet in peacetime. The skills that made them exceptional soldiers weren't valued in the civilian world, and they couldn't talk about the most significant thing they had done during the war. But they also came back with something important. They had proven to themselves and to anyone paying attention that Native American cultures had immense value, that the languages officials had tried to destroy were sophisticated and powerful, that the warrior traditions weren't primitive savagery, but highly developed tactical systems, that Native Americans could serve with distinction and honor in the most demanding military operations. This knowledge sustained them and helped fuel the Native American rights movements that would come in later decades. The legacy of the Apache code talkers extends far beyond their specific contributions to World War II. They represent a bridge between ancient warrior traditions and modern warfare, proof that indigenous knowledge systems have relevance and value in contemporary contexts. The training methods that produced Apache warriors, the emphasis on extreme physical conditioning, mental toughness, tactical thinking, and absolute discipline, are now studied by special forces units around the world. Military strategists analyze Apache warfare tactics for lessons that apply to modern counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare. The Apache warrior culture, refined over centuries of conflict against Spanish, Mexican, and American forces, had created something remarkable. It had produced warriors who could operate effectively against technologically superior enemies, who could survive and fight in extreme conditions, who could maintain cohesion and morale even when outnumbered and outgunned. These weren't skills taught in a few months of boot camp. They were the result of a lifetime of preparation, of cultural knowledge passed down through generations, of a worldview that saw warfare as a sacred duty, requiring absolute commitment. When Apache code talkers stepped onto Pacific battlefields, they carried all of this with them. They brought centuries of tactical knowledge, physical capabilities honed through the most demanding training imaginable, and mental toughness forged in conditions that would break most people. They brought a warrior ethos that emphasized duty, honor, and protection of their brothers in arms. They brought languages that proved unbreakable and skills that proved invaluable. The secret of the Apaches in World War II wasn't any single thing. It was the combination of everything they were. It was the lifetime of preparation that began with morning plunges into freezing water and running through mountains with mouths full of water. It was the 4 raids that transformed boys into warriors. It was generations of tactical knowledge refined through constant warfare against superior forces. It was a cultural system that produced individuals with capabilities that seemed superhuman to those who didn't understand where they came from. It was the irony of using languages that authorities had tried to destroy to defend the nation that had oppressed them. It was the warrior code that demanded absolute commitment to protecting their fellow soldiers, regardless of personal cost. The Apache code talkers were more effective than many other soldiers, not because they were inherently better people, but because they had been prepared their entire lives for exactly the kind of warfare the Pacific Theater demanded. They had skills and knowledge that couldn't be replicated through standard military training. They had mental toughness developed through decades of trials that would make modern special forces selection look gentle. They had tactical instincts honed through a cultural tradition that had successfully fought guerrilla campaigns against overwhelming odds for centuries. This is why the story of Apache code talkers matters. It's not just a footnote in World War II history. It's a demonstration of how indigenous knowledge systems, often dismissed as primitive or irrelevant, can provide solutions to modern problems. It's proof that cultural traditions have practical value beyond symbolism or sentiment. It's a reminder that the United States military was able to succeed in the Pacific partly because it finally recognized and utilized the capabilities of Native American warriors. Warriors whose ancestors had been fighting for survival against that same military just decades earlier. The brutal truth is this: the Apache warrior tradition was developed through centuries of existential conflict. It was refined through generations of warfare, where losing meant death or enslavement, where every battle was literally a fight for survival. This created a warrior culture more intense and demanding than anything most societies have produced. And when World War II came along, the United States was able to tap into this culture, to utilize these warriors and their knowledge in ways that contributed significantly to victory in the Pacific. The Apache code talkers proved that their warrior tradition, far from being obsolete or primitive, was actually ahead of its time in many ways. The emphasis on guerrilla tactics, on surviving in harsh conditions, on mental toughness over technology, on reading terrain and anticipating enemy movements, all of this turned out to be exactly what modern warfare required. The Japanese never encountered anything quite like Apache warriors, who brought centuries of tactical knowledge to bear against them, while simultaneously operating unbreakable communication systems using languages that the Japanese cryptographers couldn't even identify, much less decode. So when you think about World War II, when you think about the Pacific campaign, remember that among the thousands of soldiers island hopping toward Japan were men who carried with them knowledge stretching back centuries. Men who had been trained from childhood in ways that most people can't even imagine. Men who brought skills and instincts that made them exceptional warriors by any standard. The Apache code talkers weren't just radio operators who spoke a different language. They were the culmination of one of the most sophisticated warrior traditions in human history, finally recognized and utilized by the very nation that had spent decades trying to destroy their culture. And they proved, beyond any doubt, that their traditions had value, that their languages had power, that their warrior skills could change the course of history. That's the secret of the Apaches in World War II. It wasn't one thing. It was everything. It was who they were, where they came from, and what generations of warriors before them had created. It was the brutal training that forged them. It was the tactical knowledge they carried. It was the mental toughness that let them operate under conditions that broke other men. It was the warrior code that demanded absolute commitment. It was all of this combined into individuals who were simply more prepared, more capable, and more determined than almost anyone else on those battlefields. Now I want to hear from you. What surprised you most about the Apache warrior tradition? Did you know about their contributions to World War II? The story of these incredible warriors deserves to be told and retold. If you found this story as powerful as I did, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss our next incredible World War II story. And please, watch this video all the way through. We need to hit 100 comments to continue bringing you more inspiring stories like this one. Your engagement helps us keep these important histories alive. Comment below with your thoughts, your reactions, or what you learned. And if you want, tell me from which part of the world you're watching this video. Your comment matters, and I want to read it and reply. For more exciting stories like this one, click on the video appearing on your screen right now.